I just stepped out of a meeting on the 50th floor of a glass tower in Seattle, where I finalized a $2.5 billion investment deal with a transportation tech company. The firm handshake from the Japanese CEO and the admiring looks from the partners were proof that Peak Capital, my company, was leading the private investment industry. James Sullivan, 45 years old, was used to moments like these, quiet victories after months of intense negotiations. But as I pushed through the glass door into the marble lobby, my phone, set to silent, buzzed in my pocket, an email. I opened it, and everything seemed to stop. The subject line from my mother, Margaret Sullivan, was short and chilling. "The house is sold." I stood frozen in the lobby, light from the large windows illuminating the screen, highlighting every word. "James, we got a strong offer, far better than the small down payment you put in," she wrote. "So, we accepted. The contract is signed, done. No apology, no question for my input. The house in Boston, where I'd paid the mortgage for 10 years, personally painted every wall, replaced every tile in the kitchen, and covered every insurance premium, had been sold by my parents without a single word to me."
Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video.
I felt my heart sink, as if the whole world had collapsed beneath my feet. James Sullivan, 45 years old, had built Peak Capital from nothing over 15 years, advising major corporations, saving companies from bankruptcy, and delivering billions of dollars to clients. But at that moment, none of it mattered. That house was mine. It was a symbol of my independence, proof that I didn't need Sullivan Freight, my family's transportation company, or my parents' approval. I bought it to show I could stand on my own, without the Sullivan name. But the deed, my parents insisted on keeping it in their names. "Just until you're more settled, James," they said. I was in Seattle, closing the biggest deal of my career, and they sold my house behind my back. I stood motionless, eyes glued to the screen, rereading the email as if I could change the truth. But every word remained, cold and ruthless. "We needed liquidity." My mother wrote, "Sullivan Freight isn't doing well, and you're always busy with your little job in New York." Little job. If she knew I'd just signed a contract making Peak Capital a major shareholder in a leading Asian transportation tech company. If she saw how the Seattle executives nodded as I presented my investment strategy, or how a U.S. Department of Transportation official once shook my hand, asking for advice on restructuring a public investment fund. But no, to my parents, I was forever James. The dreamer, the failure, the faint shadow next to my younger brother Brandon, their golden boy, now the CEO of the crumbling Sullivan Freight. I stepped into a quiet corner of the lobby, where large windows overlooked Puget Sound. The sea sparkled under the sunlight, but I saw nothing but the anger rising within me. I dialed my mother's number. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "James," her voice rang out, radiant as if announcing joyful news. "Did you see my email? Isn't it great news?" "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hand gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "That was my house." "Oh, James, don't be so dramatic," she sighed, her tone like she was soothing a child. "Your father and I needed liquidity. Sullivan Freight isn't doing well, and you're always flying around with that little investment job of yours." Little investment job. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to quell the anger. If she knew that Peak Capital had acquired companies worth billions, from retail chains to steel manufacturers. If she knew I'd advised major corporations, pulling them back from the brink of collapse. But I said nothing. Not yet. "So where am I supposed to stay when I return to Boston?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Oh, you can stay here," she said, her voice soft but laced with condescension. "Your old room is exactly the way you left it. It'll be just like when you were 17 again. Just like when I was 17. Those words cut like a knife. At 17, I was constantly compared to Brandon, told to be realistic and abandon my dreams. At 17, my parents drained my college savings to cover Sullivan Freight's losses, without a word of apology. At 17, I swore I'd break free from their shadow. The house in Boston was the final step in fulfilling that vow. And now, they'd taken it away, as if I were nothing more than a financial resource to bail out Brandon's mistakes. "I have to go," I said, cutting the call short before she could say more. I stood there, staring at the sea, feeling like the whole world had turned its back on me. But somewhere deep inside, a fire began to burn. They thought I was weak, that I'd accept this like I always had. They were wrong. I was no longer the James of 20 years ago, silently enduring. I was James Sullivan, CEO of Peak Capital, and I would make them see that in a way they'd never expect. I hung up, but my mother's voice still echoed in my head, soft but sharp as a blade. Don't be so dramatic, James. I stood there, in the corner of the hotel lobby in Seattle, staring at Puget Sound, but seeing nothing except memories flooding back. 10 years of mortgage payments, 10 years of sweating to make the Boston house my own sanctuary. All erased by a single email from my mother, Margaret Sullivan. And now, she told me to move back to my old room. As if I were still the 17-year-old boy, weak and easily controlled. I gripped the phone tightly, trying to suppress the rage burning in my chest. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the first time my family had done this to me. And maybe, that's why I wasn't surprised. I had built Peak Capital from nothing, turning it into one of the top private investment firms on Wall Street. I had saved companies from bankruptcy, advised major corporations, and closed deals worth billions, like the one I just finalized in Seattle. But to my parents, I was forever a failure, a faint shadow next to my younger brother Brandon. Their golden boy. Brandon, 37 years old, was now the CEO of Sullivan Freight, the transportation company my parents poured their heart and soul into. The company they were willing to sacrifice anything for, including me, to save. I remembered my younger days, when I naively thought I could make my parents proud. At 18, I pitched an idea for a startup, but my father, Charles, just smirked. James, you don't have what it takes. Let Brandon handle the big stuff. When I asked for help with college tuition, they refused, saying Sullivan Freight needed the money to expand. But months later, they funneled tens of thousands of dollars into a failed business venture of Brandon's, even though he was only 16 and had no clear plan. Brandon has vision, my mother said. Me, I was just the dreamer, told to be realistic, get a steady job, marry early, and live in my brother's shadow. Now, when my mother said Sullivan Freight isn't doing well, I knew exactly why. Brandon, with his arrogance and lack of competence, had driven the company to the brink. But instead of admitting their mistake, my parents turned to me, taking the house I'd poured my heart into building. Your little investment job, my mother called Peak Capital, as if it were some trivial hobby. If she knew I'd just signed a deal, making Peak Capital a major shareholder in a top Asian transportation tech company. If she saw how the Seattle executives nodded in respect, as I laid out my strategy. But no, to my parents, I was never good enough. I stepped out of the lobby corner, back to reality. My phone buzzed again. A text from Brandon. Hey, Mom told you about the house. Sorry, but business is business. Business is business. That phrase was another knife. They'd used it to justify everything. When they refused to help with my tuition, because Brandon needed seed money for a half-baked idea. When they drained my childhood savings to cover Sullivan Freight's payroll without telling me. And now, they sold the house I paid for, because the company comes first. I stared at the text, my finger hovering over the screen. I replied simply, understood. No need to argue. No need to explain. They'd soon see who I was. I returned to the meeting room, where the $2.5 billion deal documents still sat in my briefcase, awaiting my final signature. But in my mind, I was already sketching a different plan. Sullivan Freight, the company my parents and Brandon valued above all else, was facing a full-scale audit from a new investment firm. My firm, Peak Capital. They sold my house to save their crumbling empire, but they didn't know I'd been quietly pulling the strings. In a few weeks, when they walked into Sullivan Freight's boardroom, nervously adjusting their suits, they'd look across the table and see me, not their son, but their new boss. I sat down, opened my briefcase, and signed the deal documents with the calm my family always mistook for weakness. But I wasn't the 17-year-old boy in that old room anymore. I was James Sullivan, CEO of Peak Capital, and I'd show them that sometimes revenge doesn't need shouts or courtrooms. Sometimes, it just takes a well-timed deal, and a seat at the head of the table. I stepped back into the meeting room, on the 50th floor of the Seattle Glass Tower, where the $2.5 billion deal documents still lay neatly in my briefcase. The Japanese partners were deep in discussion, but I nodded absently. My mind still caught on my mother's email, in Brandon's text. "Business is business," he wrote, as if selling the house I'd sweated to build was just a move on Sullivan Freight's chessboard. But they didn't know I was playing a far bigger game, and that game was nearing its end. I sat down, opened my briefcase, and signed the final documents with the calm my family always mistook for weakness. But in my mind, I was crafting another plan, one my parents and Brandon would never see coming. They sold my house to save their collapsing empire, but they didn't know I'd been quietly holding the reins. In a few weeks, when they walked into Sullivan Freight's boardroom, nervously adjusting their suits, they'd look across the table and see me, not their son, but their new boss. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. 20 years ago, I was just a financial analyst on Wall Street, working 16-hour days in a cramped office, dreaming of being recognized. But my family never saw that. I was told to be realistic, get a steady job, and live in my brother's shadow. At 30, I poured everything into a startup, but it crashed spectacularly. I lost everything: savings, reputation, and faith in myself. I called home, hoping for comfort, but my father just said, "I told you you couldn't do it, James. Come back and help Brandon." That was the breaking point. I swore I'd never rely on my family again. I taught myself finance, devoured hundreds of books, took night courses, and built a network on Wall Street. I learned Spanish to negotiate with South American investors, mastered complex financial statements, and step by step, built Peak Capital, a private investment firm specializing in acquiring and restructuring struggling companies. Over 15 years, I turned Peak Capital into a powerhouse. I saved an American retail chain from bankruptcy, restructured a steel manufacturer, and advised a major U.S. public pension fund. Wall Street executives started calling me the fixer, but my family had no idea. To them, I was just James with his little investment job in New York. They didn't know I'd been quietly tracking Sullivan Freight for 2 years. Ever since I saw it crumbling under Brandon's leadership. Sullivan Freight wasn't just struggling, it was in free fall. Suppliers went unpaid, bank loan interest piled up, and major clients walked away. I knew exactly why. Brandon, with his arrogance and inexperience, made a string of bad decisions, from investing in inefficient routes to ignoring modern technology. My parents, instead of fixing things, blindly trusted him, and when the company stood on the brink, they turned to me, not to apologize, but to take away my house. But I'd been moving long before that. Over the past 24 months, through a network of shell companies and anonymous investment funds, I'd been buying up Sullivan Freight's debt. Every overdue invoice, every missed loan interest payment, each step was calculated with precision. No one, not even Brandon, knew that those debts had quietly transferred into my hands. They thought I was just running a small investment firm in New York. In reality, I was James Sullivan, CEO of Peak Capital, one of the boldest acquisition firms on Wall Street. We didn't just save companies, we restructured, dismantled, and turned them into something better, or more profitable. My phone buzzed again. A text from Sarah Kim, my lawyer in Seattle. "James, your mom told you about the house," she wrote. "I'm sorry, but everything's ready. By Friday you'll own 78% of Sullivan Freight." I smiled, for the first time since reading my mother's email. Sarah was the only one who knew my entire plan. She'd helped me prepare the contracts, ensuring everything was legal and discreet. "Are the contracts finalized?" I asked in Spanish, a language I'd learned 10 years ago, while working with a Mexican conglomerate. Another chapter of my life, my family knew nothing about. I signed the Seattle deal documents with the certainty my family always thought I lacked. This wasn't just a deal, it was a reckoning. In a few weeks, I'd own a controlling stake in Sullivan Freight, the company my parents had sacrificed everything, including me, to protect. I turned to my assistant. "Book a flight to New York," I said. It's time I paid my parents a visit. I sat on the flight from Seattle to New York, the dim cabin lights illuminating the briefcase, holding the freshly signed deal documents. But my mind wasn't there. It was in Boston, where the house I'd sweated to build had been sold by my parents, without a word of consultation. I opened my laptop, checking an email from Sarah Kim, my lawyer. "All contracts are signed," she wrote. "You officially own 78% of Sullivan Freight. Congratulations, James." I smiled, but not out of joy. It was the smile of certainty, of someone who'd waited for this moment far too long. Sarah had worked with me for 2 years, helping me conceal my identity through shell companies, to buy Sullivan Freight's debt. No one, not even Brandon, knew that P Capital, the firm my mother called my little investment job, was the force behind this takeover. The plane landed in New York early in the morning. I moved into a penthouse in Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River. This apartment was a world apart from the old room my mother wanted me to return to, still filled with childhood mementos, as a reminder that I was not good enough. I ignored the calls from my mother, the desperate emails from Brandon. Let them think I was grieving over the house. Let them believe I was still James, the forgotten son, busy with his small job in New York. They didn't know I was preparing for a coup. I stood before the mirror in the penthouse, adjusting my tie. The man staring back wasn't the failure my family had mocked. He was a strategist, someone who'd waited 20 years for this moment. The navy suit fit perfectly, my hair flecked with gray, the mark of years of relentless work. I picked up the briefcase containing documents, proving ownership of 78% of Sullivan Freight. I'd bring it to Sullivan Freight's headquarters, where my father once said, "You'll never understand real business, James." I called Sarah Kim. "Is everything ready?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. "Completely ready, Mr. Sullivan," she replied. "The documents have been triple-checked. You have control. They don't stand a chance." "Good," I said, then hung up. I turned to my assistant. "Schedule a meeting with Sullivan Freight's board," I ordered. "I want to be there early." The assistant nodded. No questions asked. They were used to my decisiveness, something my family never saw. I stepped onto the balcony, looking down at Manhattan's skyline. The Hudson River sparkled under the sunlight, but inside me was a storm. This wasn't just a deal, it was a reckoning. Sullivan Freight, the house, and my entire family. They'd soon face me, not as James Sullivan, the scorned son, but as James Sullivan, CEO of Peak Capital, who turned their betrayal into fuel to build an empire. I walked through the revolving doors of Sullivan Freight's headquarters in New York. This glass and steel building was once the symbol of my family, of my father Charles, my mother Margaret, and my brother Brandon. But today, it would become the stage for a truth they never saw coming. I was no longer the overlooked son. I was the storm they didn't see approaching. The security guard at the lobby nodded in greeting. "Welcome back, Mr. Sullivan," he said, his tone respectful. I nodded back, knowing he was already on Peak Capital's payroll. Funny how things change. 20 years ago, my father scolded me in this very building for dropping a stack of papers. "You'll never understand real business, James," he said. Now I was about to walk into the top floor boardroom, where my family was panicking over an anonymous investment firm taking over Sullivan Freight. The elevator ride to the 30th floor felt like an eternity. I stood there, adjusting my tie, replaying everything in my mind. The years of being compared to Brandon, the times they drained my savings to cover the company's losses, the taunts when I failed at 30, and most recently, their sale of my Boston house, the house I paid the mortgage on for 10 years, to save Sullivan Freight. Each memory was a knife, but also fuel for my resolve. Today, I'd show them who James Sullivan really was. The elevator doors opened, revealing a marble-floored hallway lined with portraits of Sullivan Freight's founders. My mother's laughter echoed from the boardroom, light but forced, as if she were trying to mask her anxiety. I adjusted my suit jacket, took a deep breath, and walked forward. My father's voice, Charles, rang out, firm but trembling. "This has to be a mistake. Some anonymous firm can't just buy Sullivan Freight. We built this from nothing." "I checked 3 times, Brandon replied, his voice tense. Peak Capital owns 78% of the shares. They also hold most of our debt. We have no choice but to meet their CEO today. My mother chimed in, trying to stay optimistic. It's probably just a paperwork issue. We've been through worse. We always come out on top. That's when I pushed open the boardroom door. All eyes turned to me. My father frowned, his voice thick with irritation. James, this meeting is for board members only. Whatever tantrum you're having about the house can wait. I walked forward, calm but resolute, setting my briefcase on the table with a soft thud. Actually, I'm right on time, I said, my voice steady but sharp. The CEO of Peak Capital is scheduled to meet with you at 10 o'clock. Brandon furrowed his brow, glancing at his watch. Right, but he's not. He stopped, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He's here, I interrupted, opening my briefcase and pulling out a stack of documents. I'm the CEO of Peak Capital. Silence engulfed the room. My mother's coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. My father's face turned pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. Brandon stared at me, mouth agape, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. No way, he muttered. You just run a small investment firm in New York. You can't be what? I cut in, tilting my head slightly. Capable, ambitious, or just too much of a failure to surpass your family's legacy. I placed the documents on the table, each page perfectly organized. You'll find everything in order. Peak Capital holds majority ownership of Sullivan Freight, along with controlling seats on the board. As of this morning, I'm your boss. My father grabbed the documents, his hands trembling. What kind of joke is this? He muttered, his voice breaking. This can't be. No, it's a lesson, I said, my voice calm but cutting like a blade. A lesson in what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. I locked eyes with my father. Like the joke of selling my house without asking. Like the joke of draining my college savings without a word. Or the joke of calling me a failure while I built a multinational investment firm right under your noses. My father opened his mouth, but my mother spoke first, her voice shaking. We needed that money for the company, James. To protect our family's legacy. Legacy, I repeated, letting out a short laugh. Look around, Mom. This isn't your legacy anymore. It's mine. I turned to the board, some of whom were hiding smirks. They'd endured my family's arrogance and incompetence for years. Today, they were witnessing the tide turn. Starting today, things change, I declared, my voice ringing through the room. Brandon, you're relieved of your role as CEO, effective immediately. His mouth fell open, speechless. Dad, you're stepping down as chairman. And Mom, your position as head of communications is no longer needed. You dare fire your own family? Brandon shouted, his face red. Your own family? I remembered the birthdays missed, because my parents told me to watch the phones for the company. The vacations canceled, because they needed a little help. The way they mocked my first investment idea, like it was a school project. No, I said, my voice icy. I'm giving you the same chance you gave me. The chance to prove your worth. I opened a personnel file. Brandon, there's an opening in accounts receivable. Dad, we need door-to-door sales reps for the new project. Mom, the front desk could use someone with a warm smile and a good memory. My mother covered her face, sobbing. My father stared at me, his face ashen, like he might collapse. Or, I continued, closing the file, you can clear your desks by 5 p.m. Your choice. You ungrateful bastard. My father roared, but I raised a hand to stop him. Careful, I said, my voice razor sharp. You're talking to your boss. I gathered my documents, preparing to leave. But before walking out, I turned back. Oh, about the house you sold? They looked up, their eyes frantic. I bought the real estate company that owns it. The deed will be back in my name by tomorrow. The looks on their faces were priceless. Shock mixed with sweet justice. I walked out, head high, my power intact. No longer the invisible son, no longer underestimated. The stunned looks of my father Charles, my mother's, Margaret's, sobs, and the shocked silence of my brother Brandon, still lingered in my mind. They just learned that I wasn't just the overlooked son, but the new boss of the empire they'd sacrificed everything. including my house to protect. But I wasn't done. The looks on their faces were priceless. Shock mixed with fear, as if their entire world had just crumbled before them. My mother covered her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs. My father stared at me, lips moving but unable to form words. Brandon, his face flushed red, just stood there, hands gripping the back of his chair. I didn't wait for their reactions. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, my heels echoing sharply on the marble floor, crisp and final. Behind me, I heard my mother's muffled sobs, my father's helpless shouting, and Brandon's heavy silence. But for the first time in 45 years, those sounds didn't reach me. They no longer had the power to hurt me. I stepped into the elevator, feeling as if I'd shed a burden that had weighed on my shoulders for 2 decades. The years of being compared to Brandon, the times my parents drained my savings to cover Sullivan Freight's losses, the taunts when I failed, all had led me to this moment. The house in Boston, where I'd paid the mortgage for 10 years, and personally painted every wall, wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of my independence, a vow that I'd never need my family to stand tall. When they sold it, they thought I'd accept it, like I always had, but they underestimated me. Their biggest mistake. The elevator opened to the lobby. The security guard, now a Peak Capital employee, nodded to me again. "Have a great day, Mr. Sullivan," he said, a subtle smile on his face. I nodded back and stepped out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, where New York's frenetic pace greeted me. But inside, everything was strangely calm. I had reclaimed what they'd stolen. My house, Sullivan Freight, and above all my self-respect. I called Sarah Kim, my lawyer. "Sarah, how's the paperwork for the house?" I asked, my voice steady but unable to hide my satisfaction. "It's done, James," she replied. "The real estate company has transferred ownership. The Boston house is officially yours again tomorrow." She paused, then added, "Congratulations. They didn't see you coming, did they?" "Not at all," I said, smiling. "But they know now." I hung up, standing amid the crowds on Wall Street, looking up at the skyscrapers. Sullivan Freight, the company my parents valued above everything, was now mine. But I didn't plan to keep it as a trophy. I would restructure it, transform it into a modern transportation company, using technology like autonomous trucks and logistics software. Brandon, with his poor decisions, had let the company free fall. I'd fix it, not for my family, but for myself, to prove I could do it 100 times better than them. As for the Boston house, I'd thought about it a lot. I could return, live in the rooms I'd renovated, and savor my victory. But I didn't want to. That house, though a symbol of independence, also carried memories of betrayal. Instead, I decided to turn it into a youth support center, for young people dismissed by their families, as I once was. I'd fund scholarships, provide mentorship, and help them build futures without needing anyone's approval. That's how I'd turn pain into purpose, my victory into something greater. I returned to my Manhattan penthouse, overlooking the shimmering Hudson River. I opened my laptop and began drafting plans to restructure Sullivan Freight. Calls from my mother and emails from Brandon kept coming, but I didn't open them. Let them think I was grieving over the house. Let them believe I was still James, the invisible son, easily manipulated. They didn't know I'd been preparing for this moment for 20 years. And now, I stood at the peak of my own making. I looked out the window, feeling a rare peace. Sullivan Freight, the house, and my entire family. They'd all faced me, not as James Sullivan, the forgotten son, but as James Sullivan, CEO of Peak Capital, who turned their betrayal into fuel to build an empire. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the start of a new chapter, one I'd write on my own terms. I sat in my father's old office, at Sullivan Freight's headquarters in New York. Now mine. The leather chair swiveled smoothly, the ebony desk gleamed, and his portrait hung on the wall, all once symbols of family power. But now, sunlight from the large window hit the desk, reflecting my image in the glass behind it. I picked up the Wall Street Journal on the desk, chuckling at the headline, "Peak Capital acquires Sullivan Freight, CEO reveals identity in boardroom shakeup." The article detailed the moment I walked into the boardroom, declared ownership of 78% of the shares, and fired my father, mother, and brother, Brandon. An unknown CEO, they wrote, as if I were a phantom emerging from nowhere. If they knew I'd built this moment through years of learning, silence, and strategic moves. If they understood that the anonymity my family mocked was my greatest weapon. I looked out at Manhattan's skyline, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds. The Hudson River sparkled below, but inside me was a rare calm. 20 years ago, I was a financial analyst, working 18-hour days on Wall Street, dreaming of my parents' recognition. But they only saw Brandon, the golden boy tasked with running Sullivan Freight. They drained my college savings to cover the company's losses, refused support when I needed startup capital, and sold my Boston house, where I'd paid the mortgage for 10 years to bail out Brandon's mistakes. Each betrayal was a knife, but also fuel to build Peak Capital, a private investment firm acquiring and restructuring billion-dollar businesses. Yesterday in the boardroom, I took it all back. Not just Sullivan Freight or the house, but the self-respect they tried to steal. I remembered my mother's, Margaret's, stunned look as her coffee cup shattered on the floor. My father's helpless shouts when I announced his dismissal. Brandon's shocked silence when he realized I, the brother they always belittled, was now his boss. But my victory wasn't in those looks. It was in proving I didn't need their approval to succeed. I believed in myself, and that was all that mattered. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah Kim, my Seattle lawyer. "Congratulations, James," she wrote. "How'd the meeting go?" I smiled, replying briefly, "Better than expected. Time to rebuild Sullivan Freight my way." I began drafting restructuring plans, integrating modern technology, like autonomous trucks and logistics software. Brandon's bad decisions had let the company plummet. I'd make it a leading transportation firm, not to please my family, but to prove I could outdo them 100-fold. I picked up the phone and called a real estate firm. "Hi, I'd like to put a property on the market," I said, "the house on Chestnut Street, Boston, the one the Sullivan family just sold." I paused, listening to their question. "Oh, don't worry," I continued. "I own it now. Bought the holding company last week. Market price, no discounts for family." I hung up, feeling satisfaction wash over me. Sometimes justice comes as a scandal, sometimes a lawsuit. But for me, it came when I walked into the boardroom, with papers proving I owned everything they once had. And now, sitting in this office, I knew my victory wasn't just revenge. It was proving I could be the best version of myself, despite what they thought. This victory wasn't just my story. It was a reminder that anyone underestimated can rise, if they believe in themselves. I sat at the desk, opened my laptop, and began writing a call to action, a message for those who'd been dismissed by family or society, as I once was. If you've been told you're not good enough, that your dreams are unrealistic, that you should be practical, and give up, my story might be part of yours. I want to hear your experiences, not just to share, but to remind each other that quiet strength is still strength, and you don't need to shout to be recognized. You just need to keep moving forward. My journey wasn't just about acquiring Sullivan Freight or reclaiming the Boston house. It was about finding my own voice, my own worth, and everything my family said I couldn't have. It was about becoming the best version of myself, the version they never thought I could achieve. And now, I want to share that lesson with you. You don't owe anyone proof of your potential. You only owe yourself the chance to become everything they said you couldn't. I picked up the phone and called Sarah Kim, my lawyer. "Sarah, has the scholarship fund launched yet?" I asked. "It's underway, James," she replied, her voice brimming with excitement. "We've received dozens of applications. You're making a big difference." "Thanks," I said, smiling. "Speed it up. I want to help more people." I stood and stepped onto the balcony of my Manhattan penthouse. A gentle breeze carried the pulse of New York, the city that never sleeps, where I built my empire. I looked down at the Hudson River, feeling a freedom I'd never known while trapped in my family's shadow. I had become someone they never saw, strong, resolute, and true to my values. If my story resonates with you, I hope you'll share yours. Have you been doubted by family? Have you worked in silence, building something great while others saw only failure? Tell me. Let's remind each other that you don't need to shout to prove your worth. Just walk into the room like you own it, because one day you just might. I stepped back into the office, ready for the next chapter. Peak Capital would keep expanding, supporting startups led by the underestimated. Sullivan Freight would become a symbol of innovation, not failure. And I, James Sullivan, would keep moving forward, not for anyone else, but for myself. The story of James Sullivan, a 45-year-old man in the United States, is a powerful testament to perseverance and self-belief in the context of today's competitive and individualized American culture. In the story, James overcomes his family's dismissal. These actions reflect the family pressures and unfair expectations many Americans face, especially in families with business traditions or favoritism toward one member. However, James didn't let their mockery or betrayal define him. Instead, he taught himself finance, built Peak Capital on Wall Street, and quietly acquired Sullivan Freight, transforming it into a modern transportation company with autonomous trucks. His journey, from a financial analyst to a powerful CEO, embodies the American spirit, resilience, innovation, and the ability to turn adversity into opportunity. The lesson from this story is that you don't need validation from others, even family, to succeed in today's American society. Culture values individualism and self-reliance, but pressure from family or society can make you doubt yourself. James chose to work in silence, learn Spanish to negotiate internationally, and turn the sold house into a support center for youth dismissed by their families. An act of social responsibility. The advice is to find your own worth, as James did when building Peak Capital, and invest in yourself through learning, patience, and strategy. Even if underestimated, you can create your own boardroom, as James did, and step into it with confidence, knowing the greatest success is becoming the best version of yourself. If my story inspires you, please subscribe to follow the journeys of overcoming challenges and building success for people like James Sullivan. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore more stories of quiet strength.